Glad to know you're still with us. Zambia is making strides towards financial recovery after a 3-year debt default. Following a successful agreement with sovereign bondholders last week, the nation now sets its sights on restructuring an additional $3.3 billion of commercial debt. This move signifies Zambia's determination to emerge from its economic struggles. Joining me from all of this is Cheelo, economist and managing partner, Equilibria Consulting Limited. He joins me from Lusaka, Zambia. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
All right. So can you elaborate on the progress made with this almost there negotiations with some commercial creditors? Because, I mean, that's what we hear. You know, we're almost there on some and all of that. So what's this almost there all about, really? Are there sticking points with, you know, any specific creditors?
As far as I know, no sticking points. I think almost there basically means there was a sequence. So first of all, the official creditors, a deal was struck, or restructuring agreement in principle, for $6.3 billion. Subsequent to that, I think that was around August of 2023. More recently, the bondholders have agreed in principle to a restructuring deal of $3.8 billion. So out of about $13.4 billion, Zambia is talking about currently agreements in principle of restructuring of $10.1 billion, which is 75% of the total debt stock. So we're almost there, but there's still 25%, which is $3.3 billion that the other private creditors hold, that now needs to be negotiated with in this last stage of debt restructuring negotiations.
All right, I'd like you to elaborate on, you know, the specific mechanics of, you know, how the debt exchange for international bonds will be executed.
Yeah, in terms of bondholders, the bonds, how they are exchanged, I think there's a negotiation that has to further take place that actually ropes in other international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, particularly the IMF, in terms of determining within the debt restructuring what debt can be swapped for financing coming from the IMF. As far as I understand, it's a pretty lengthy and complex process, and will require further discussions of three parties. Those parties being the Zambian authorities or the Zambian government, the IMF/World Bank on the one side, and then the bondholders, basically honoring the nitty-gritties of the debt restructuring deal. If you check with the debt restructuring deal, there are certain elements from the bondholders that are haircuts, and there are certain grace period, there are certain amounts that have to now be paid. So for those amounts that have to be paid, clearly Zambia is still in fiscal constraint and would look to amortize over a period of time using sort of third funds from the likes of the IMF. So those are I think, the debt swaps or debt exchanges that need to now be discussed and take place.
All right, let's talk about this. You know, looking at the government's effort, you know, what is it doing to address public concerns about the long-term sustainability of its debt levels, even after this restructuring is, you know, done or concluded?
Yeah, I think ahead of the conclusion of the restructuring, first of all, we saw the Zambian government successfully negotiating a credit facility from the IMF, $1.3 billion equivalent. And while compared to the debt stock, that looks like a small amount, any IMF arrangement comes with a lot of benchmarks, including fiscal and debt management benchmarks, benchmarks to show that the country is actually progressing or will progress once the restructuring is done towards a path of debt sustainability. So that's one line that was already done. along the way, the current administration has, I think, in my view, done a great job in restoring fiscal discipline, fiscal prudency, minimizing borrowing. If you see the fiscal deficits are always lower than targets. So restraint on borrowing, improvements in revenue collections, restraint on excessive spending. Just yesterday, there was a very strongly worded statement from the head of state talking about now that we have achieved debt restructuring, the bulk of debt restructuring, our next responsibility is to ensure that we never find ourselves in such a debt crisis again by ensuring that we have all the mechanisms, policy mechanisms, legal mechanisms, and others, institutional strengthening to make sure that slippages don't happen, excessive borrowing doesn't happen, some of which in the past was laced with corruption and rent-seeking and so on. Those things never happen again because we have all the safeguards in place. So that is something that's already been happening, and the Ministry of Finance has risen to the task of fiscal management, of debt management, but a lot more still needs to be done, particularly that for a protracted period of time, public institutions were really weakened, and at the core of them still have slippage challenges that need to be closed up.
But I like what you said about, fiscal responsibility and all of that. I'm just wondering if this did not happen. I mean, if this conversation didn't start, if we didn't have IMF and all of these other creditors monitoring and ensuring that the process is followed through, would Zambia have, decided to do this on its own? That's on the one hand. And then on another hand, I'm also thinking, after this whole process is done, I hope that this, prudence we now see will continue.
On the first question, Zambia, remember, defaulted in November of 2020. And according to international law, according to international convention, particularly for the bonds, the bondholder debt, that was supposed to be recalled immediately and paid in full. That would have rendered Zambia bankrupt. To service any of its debt, to pay back, and it would have taken into course a sort of international arbitration process that would require Zambia to liquidate a lot of its strategic assets. So one way or the other, something would have had to give, and Zambia would have had to come to the table of some painful debt management or debt maneuvering. The saving grace in this case is that we had a political shift, a change of regime, and the new regime was able to win international confidence over and work with the IMF to hold all the different creditors at bay as the negotiations were taking place. Of course, there's an accumulation behind the scenes of interests and so on, but this is all part of the nuances of the debt restructuring deal. Now, on the second question,
if you can do that in less than 30 seconds, very quickly.
Sure, in less than 30 seconds. I think the main things is to put legal safeguards, which the government is doing. So legal limits on borrowing, for example, and then put policy safeguards and put institutional safeguards.
All right.
Once those three things are done, I think it's a done deal for Zambia to be debt sustainable.
Absolutely, institutional and policy safeguards. Thank you so much, Cesar Cheelo, Economist and Managing Partner, Equilibria Consulting Limited. Thank you for your time on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.